All right, everyone, buckle on in because today's painting is a doozy. We have a trifecta of black fur, curly fur, and not one, but two subjects with no eyes. So let's go ahead, grab our paintbrushes, and let's work through this painting together. So to get started, I have the brushes I will be using for today's video listed, as well as the paint colors I will be using throughout this painting. Now, the first thing that I want to complete is getting the background finished and layer the dogs in on top of it later on. So I'm starting off with a very light wash of purple with a cheap makeup blending brush that I actually picked up from the drugstore a very long time ago. And so I didn't want to go too opaque at first until I knew that I had the right blend of purple and I was happy with the mixture. I essentially just didn't want to waste my time. And so for this section of the painting, you can choose whichever color you prefer. Just my clients had requested this specific background color. Once you have the wash completed, we can go ahead now and start to layer some of the more opaque paint over top. And I find I begin at the bottom of a painting with a darker shade of that color. So for instance, in today's video, it's purple. And as I progress towards the top of the painting, I'm adding in hints of titanium white to make it lighter. Now, I always love to have a subtle gradient as I find it a lot more visually appealing than just having one solid background color. I find that it creates a much more dynamic painting once the painting is completed. Now, once your background has dried, and I recommend it being completely dry before we move on, we can go ahead with the first step in painting our dog. So the most exciting part of this painting is getting these pups down onto our canvas. So I am using a medium filbert brush for this area of the painting with a very watered down mixture of black paint. Now, this is very reminiscent to working with a watercolor wash, so it is very, very translucent. And essentially with this mixture, I'm going to block in this subject and all of the darkest areas that I can find within my reference. Now, because this subject does not have visible eyes in the portrait, I found that this light block in wash was the best way to solidify the anatomy and really ensure the likeness to the subject. Now, I have to admit, at this stage in the painting, I was really nervous. You can see by my brushstrokes that I am not confident at all in what I was doing, as I've never painted a dog like this before, and now I have to paint two of them. The eyes of the subject for me are always my waypoint. If you've watched my videos before, you'll know that I start every single video the same. Get the outline of the eyes done. Let's do the eyes first. And so to not have that, I felt like I was missing that security blanket or a really good foundation to start with. So I am just going to say a little prayer and block in this entire subject along with his little sister beside him, following the anatomy of the face, the curly eyebrows, the long mustache that these Bernedoodles have, and any other areas of reference that I think are the most important and the most identifiable. And the more water you add, this is a little trick that I found, the more water that you add, the lighter this wash will be. So if you are feeling at any stage in this painting uncomfortable like I was, making it lighter might be a little bit better and help ease that art anxiety, and we can just layer and layer and layer as we start to feel a little bit more confident. Now, not everyone is going to be painting two dogs alongside me today, so whether you're painting one dog or two dogs, we're going to go ahead and get these base layers down, and I'll catch up with you once it's dry. Alright, so once that base layer has dried, we can go ahead now and start to work on layer 2, which is going to be much more opaque than our first layer and hopefully a lot more confident. So we're going to start off by using Mars Black and a small filbert brush, and we're going to block in the deepest areas of the face and the curls of this Bernedoodle. So for example, this is going to be where the eyes are deep set into the face and where those eyebrows hang over, the biggest clumps of fur that I can see, and of course areas like behind the ears that are tucked away and no light is actually hitting those areas. I'm essentially going to commit to my initial wash and just confirm those places' locations. Once those deep layers have dried, I'm going to take a mixture of Mars Black, Titanium White, and Phthalo Blue together to create a very cool gray color that I'm going to use to start to layer the fur texture as well as the pattern to this Bernedoodle. Now, creating black fur is all about layering, and I always recommend having 3 to 4 different shades of gray, blue, black mixed on your palette that we can interchange to throughout this painting journey. I am taking my small filbert and I'm now going to start start blocking in the clumps of curls that I can see, along with building the shape of this face even further. We want to build some dimension now and slowly start to make this head less flat against the canvas and really start to bring this pup to life. Now, a tip that I have found helpful when painting fur is to also select brushes that really do the job for you and make painting much easier. And that's why I really landed on the filbert, and I use it in pretty much every single painting. Is I find it thick enough to create the nice clumps, the big clumps of hair that I can see, but it also has a very thin edge that at the end of your brushstroke allows for a really nice paint flick. It kind of creates some wispy runaway hairs too, depending on the angle that you're holding it. But it is important to keep in mind that at this stage in our journey, we are only worrying about the base clumps of hair and not painting in any details within this fur. So if we start to noodle around too much, we get too focused on the fine hairs, this painting will not only take much longer than it should or could, and it will not have the depth that we're going for. So I always say to myself, and even to this day, remember to keep it simple, and we're just blocking in at this point. So put that brush down if you find that you're kind of picking too much. Just block it in and we'll start to do the details later on, but just block it in. Keep it simple. So while that second layer is drying, what I'm going to do is I'm essentially going to try to be as productive as possible and work in a base layer around the muzzle and the body of this Bernedoodle. So I'm using my small filbert again, and I'm using a color combination of a little bit of Mars Black, titanium white, so I'm making a gray, but I'm also adding in a light, slight undertone of some burnt sienna and burnt umber. So this is much more on the warm side in comparison to the cool gray that we were using for those sort of texture clumps. So I'm just going to go ahead, block in this muzzle area, and then I'm going to go ahead and block in the body as well, just keeping my productivity high, and then we can go ahead and work on the hair once it has dried completely. Next, once those layers have dried, I'm going to do what I like to call a joining layer between my original base paint and my lighter highlight clumps of fur. Now, this joining layer will be a darker color than my highlight, but a tad lighter than my original base. Confusing, I know. And the reason why I choose to do this layer is so that the hair starts to become something and looks as though it is joined together and not just kind of flat on the head looking lifeless. And you'll see that I tend to put these paint strokes where the hair sprouts from the skin and continue to define these clumps even further before I bring in any further highlights. So I'm just wanting to make sure that there is some cohesion here, that it's starting to look like one element and not just flat painted kind of thrown onto this canvas. So the next stage in our painting is the most fun in my opinion, and where you will start to see the painting and your subjects come to life. Now, using my small round brush and a light blue gray, so a mixture of phthalo blue, Mars Black, and titanium white, I'm going to start to layer in the highlights on this dog portrait. Now, we want to make sure in our paint mixture that we are not going too bright right off the bat. We want to really pay close attention to these different layers of highlights, the fur, and really layer them in slowly. So I might end up doing 6 to 7 layers of different level of highlights in one portrait, depending on the lighting and the level of brightness. So keep that in mind. You might have to tone down that titanium white a little bit and not use as much. I get really heavy-handed with this. I get excited to highlight, and then I realize that I got a little carried away, and the dog starts to look more black and white than it does a sort of natural shine. So just keep that in mind. And speaking of shine, it's also important to note that in my fur mixture, I have added in some phthalo blue. And I find when painting black fur that by adding in what I call like a secondary color to my gray creates a much more realistic portrait. And sometimes this undertone, it doesn't have to be blue. It could be brown, purple, green, depending on the lighting conditions, the dog breed, or even like the level of wetness in the fur can change this color. So be sure to look at your reference very closely and find the areas where you can see this very slight, subtle sort of color reflection and add that in accordingly. All right, so once you have that first initial highlight layer put in, we're going to go ahead and add in a secondary layer of highlights to this portrait now, but we're going to use a smaller, thinner brush than we used before. Now, I'm changing to this thinner brush because I want the highlight layer on top to be thinner than the last, and so this will allow us to create the depth we're looking for in this portrait, and it will allow all of the layers of highlights that we've done so far to shine through and be visible to the viewer. We don't want to cover over our first initial layer with a brighter color because we want all of our hard work to be visible. We want to see this depth and this sort of texture that we're creating and not just essentially cover over it. So it's important to leave some of the strands darker. Maybe in some areas, we're only going to highlight the tips of the hair where the sun or the light is catching, or maybe we make the same exact brushstroke, but it's thinner over top of this hair to create a sort of gloss or a shine on this existing highlight. And by changing this up, we can start to create that texture of this Bernedoodle's fur. And because a Bernedoodle is so messy or the hair is moving in different directions, this really is a great technique that kind of creates this look for us with minimal effort. Now, you will see in some areas, I'm starting to add the white texture to the fur pattern on this Bernedoodle's head, kind of in the center of the forehead, and then starting my way down the muzzle as well. So anytime I begin with a new color pattern or texture in fur, I always kind of choose that middle tone color, and then I go in with my shadow layers and my highlights later on. Something to note as well for this area in the painting is at the end of my highlight layers for the section that I am working in, I always tend to finish off with my liner brush and add in any details that I think I might have missed or that needed to be added back into the painting. So maybe I've gone a little bit too dark. I want to add in a little bit more of a shadow, or if something got a little bit too clean, I need to kind of mess it up a little bit, I will add those back in. So for example, in this section, I'm adding in my lightest gray-blue highlight, so the brightest shine I can see on this fur. I'm adding that in with my liner, as well as I'm adding in some stray runaway hairs for the side of this Bernedoodle's head to create a much more realistic appearance. And that is a big piece of advice I can give to any level of acrylic painter, whether you are just starting or if you're a pro, been painting for a long time. Always remember to leave some sort of texture or brushstroke going out into the background so that it appears as though this subject is not just placed there, but it is a part of this painting. And I used to do this a lot. I loved the look of clean, tidy backgrounds. I would be so proud of the gradient or the misty ombre effect that I put into my background that I didn't want to cover it. And so my subject was kind of cut out onto the background and just looked like it was slapped there, like placed there. It didn't have a place in my painting. It was just kind of floating. And so by adding in these kind of stray runaway hairs off the side, although you may be covering some of your hard work with that background, it will create a much more realistic painting. And it just, for me, in my opinion, it just looks nicer. And I think it just creates an overall just good feeling to your painting. All right, so we're kind of jumping ahead a little bit in time, so please excuse the nose being outlined. I promise we will get to it, but I did want to edit this part in the painting first, since this technique is very important and we were already working on our fur. So that technique is called glazing, and for those who are unfamiliar, glazing is essentially taking a very light wash of a color. Normally, I will glaze in a burnt umber or Mars black, and this is to create a shadow or a depth to a piece, soften a part of your painting, and make it much more realistic and more subtle, if you will. And so for this part in the painting, now that all my highlights are completed and I like the way that they look, I'm going to go ahead and use my small blender brush with a very light wash of Mars Black. So I'm adding in a ton of water, and I'm going to slowly start to layer in this glaze in the areas that I think got a little bit too harsh or a bit too bright. And you'll see that I'm doing it a lot at the base of the hair where it comes out of the head. I'm using a glaze there to soften it and create essentially what I like to call a natural gradient, and just kind of bringing back some of those shadows in those midtones if I feel like my highlights got a little bit too much. And again, we don't want to cover over all of our hard work. So as soon as I feel like those highlights are too much, you'll see that I bring in glazes all the time. So the next area of the painting we are going to work on is that of the muzzle. So we're going to work on the lips, the nose, the cheek area, and really just get this finished so that by the time we work on the canvas right-hand side, we have a very cohesive, completed subject. Now to get started, I'm using a dark gray color with my liner and my small round brush, and I'm just blocking in all the areas of the dark shadows that I can see or the darker hair. So on a lot of these type of dog breeds, the Bernedoodles, the Poodles, they have a longer mustache, if you will. So on this particular subject, they had a much darker center of the lip area. So I'm going to use a darker gray and just go ahead and block that in. And then once I feel good about that, I'm going to go ahead with a lighter color on top and just slowly start to block in the areas of the highlights. Now, I'm not going to come in right away with titanium white. I'm only going to step up that highlight about 10 to 20% each time. This is just a guideline for those really final white highlights later on. Now, I've decided kind of while I've been chit-chatting here to go ahead and add in the nose outline. And if you've watched my videos before, you'll know normally I would do this at the very beginning, but because the subject did not have any visible eyes, I waited until now to outline it. And essentially, I'm just making sure I have a good guide for the size and the shape of this nose before I go ahead and start to add in now what are the base color layers before we go ahead and add some details. So using my small round brush, I'm just going to go ahead and mix a sort of medium gray color, and then I'm going to go ahead and add in a lighter blue gray on top, which we will start to highlight and add details to later on. While that area in the painting is drying, I'm going to go ahead and work on the canvas right-hand side of the face and mirror it to the canvas left side that we just completed. Now, essentially, we are going to rinse and repeat these steps and work on joining the three areas of the face together. So we're really working on creating a cohesive painting now. So we're going to start with our medium and our small filbert, and we're going to work on blocking in those large clumps of hair that we can see within our reference. Now, remember to keep things loose and blocky at this stage. So we don't want to go into our detailing too soon. We want to make sure that we're layering accordingly with both color and size and texture. So once you have those blocked in clumps completed, what I like to do is I like to join them together using a darker gray and really just soften the area in between the clumps, behind the clumps, and really just kind of make it look as though these hairs are sprouting from the head. Once you have that completed, you're feeling good about the stages so far, your last step in this area is going to be the highlights. So we're going to use our small round brush or a liner brush or both, and we're going to have 10 to 20% varying light grays already pre-mixed on our palette, and we're going to use those in select random locations. So you're going to highlight in this 10 to 20% variation and really just have these hairs highlighted in, let's say, stray, messy areas following the clumps. You're going to want to mix it up and have a bunch of different brush strokes, and this is going to help keep things realistic and not so perfect and neat and tidy. The next step in our painting is to go ahead and finalize the white brush strokes on the muzzle and start working on the nose itself. So to start off, I'm using my liner brush with a bright mixture of titanium white and the slightest amount of burnt sienna just to warm it up a little bit, and I'm blocking in the brightest areas on the muzzle that I can see. Now, this dog has a very white mouth and nose on the top that transitions to a darker brown and a more burnt sienna color on the bottom. So I wanted to get these white areas painted in first, and then we'll work on going ahead and getting that color added in afterwards. And I'll show you how to do that without color mixing. But just as we did with the head fur, we want to make sure we are leaving some of that midtone and that shadow color to be visible underneath to create that depth we are looking for. So we don't want to cover over this entire muzzle and bridge of the nose with this white color and sort of erase everything that we were working on. Now, if you do happen to go too light, don't forget we do have glazing in our back pocket that we can bring in some more shadows, or you can go ahead on top once the paint has dried with a darker color as well. So just keep that in mind. Once that has dried, we can go ahead now and start working on the nose texture and continue to build the shape and lighting details. To start off, I'm using my small round brush and I'm going to darken the bottom area of the nose as this is the most heavily shadowed area and is not as visible as the top where the light is reflecting. If you are not comfortable to jump right into a dark gray color, you can create 20 to 30% decreases in gray at a time and layer them until you reach the color that you are happy with and the location of that shadow as well. So what I would do if I chose this method is to add a little bit of Mars Black each time my paintbrush left the painting and went to my palette. I can add in a little bit of Mars Black each time and decrease that shadow layer by layer until I hit the color that I'm happy with. Now, if you don't like color mixing and it's really not your thing, you can also use a glaze for this area as well, bringing in a much darker Mars Black glaze, adding in some water, and layering that accordingly as well. So 2 options to do this. Whatever you feel comfortable with will give you the same result. Next, we will bring in a light blue-gray highlight to the top of the dog's nose, and typically I achieve this with the stippling technique. Now, for anyone who is unfamiliar what stippling is, it basically is a collection of tiny dots to create texture or highlights and shadows within your paintings or your drawings. So if we zoom into the dog's nose here in our reference, we will see that it has all these little bumps and pits that make up this very leathery texture that is on dogs' noses. And through my experience painting, this is the best way to create this texture. Stippling is the most minimal amount of effort for this area, and I always want to work smarter, not harder, and so I found this to be the most helpful and the easiest way to achieve this. Now, with stippling, I typically will do 2 to 3 layers of dots, and I will increase the lightness each time until I hit the highest highlight. This normally will be a few dots of titanium white at the end, so the topmost layer, to really bring in that punch wetness that most dogs have in photographs, so where that light is really being reflected. I also like to bring in a few darker dots into the highlighted area to create more cohesion between the 2 areas of that shadowed area and the highlight layer. So I want to create one nose, one element, and not have 2 very distinct pieces, if that makes sense. I tend to put some light gray highlights along the nose holes and the sides of the nose to create some more glossy effects. So I'll usually water down some titanium white, kind of like a white glaze, and I will add that in along all the areas of highlights that I can see. And if I find that it gets a little bit too bright, I will bring in a dark glaze, once it has dried, of course, to soften it a little bit further. So glazing, stippling really do make a big difference when painting dog noses, and I hope you find it helpful. While I start to work on the base layers of the body, I did want to mention that for the mouth area and the darker parts that are more brown, I completed that using a glaze of burnt sienna and burnt umber and my blending brush. Through my footage, I could see that I added a little bit in this last segment, but for whatever reason, the rest of that footage seems to be missing of me glazing that. So we were just going to add that in over top of the white muzzle brushstrokes that we completed earlier using a burnt sienna, burnt umber combo, watered down with my blender brush, and you're going to use as much as you prefer or as much as you see in the reference. So I did just want to cover that really, really quickly as I'm painting here, so I didn't forget. So just glaze that in according to your reference, and then we can go ahead and move on to the body. While I was chit-chatting, I did start the base of the body using a square brush, which was odd for me. You can use a filbert, round, square, whatever you prefer. I was switching it up to a square, apparently, using a warm gray color of Mars Black, titanium white, mixed with some burnt umber and burnt sienna to taste. So just a touch in some areas to kind of warm it up a little bit. And once that dried, I'm following it up with my original black color used for the base of the face in this portrait, and I'm going to complete the body on both sides. So essentially, I am just prepping the area as we did before I start adding in any details or any curls to this painting. Once that base has dried, I'm going to come in with Mars Black straight out of the tube and my square or filbert brush and start to block in the darkest areas of fur that I can see on the body. And when I am painting this, I am keeping in mind the darkest patches and the direction of the future curls and fur pattern and painting accordingly. So you really want to make sure that you are paying attention to your light source. So where on the chest is the light brightest? Is it on the shoulder, the backside? Depending on your lighting, this area will change. And then of course those shadows underneath the sort of chin, the ears if they are longer, etc. So just keep all of that in mind when you are starting with this Mars Black color. Now, I will also start to add in some of the darker colors within the chest fur at the same time, which will end up being a darker gray. So I will switch between my filbert, my round brush, my square brush, and my blender brush to create all the textures that I am looking for. And again, remember, if color mixing is not your thing, glazes will also work in multiple layers to achieve this look as well. Speaking of glazing, you can see here that I start to use some glazing for under the chin area, which is casting a shadow. So rather than remixing and trying to find that specific color that I am looking for, I found it easier to darken this manually by myself using a semi-dry blender brush and my Mars Black mixture and brushing that in by itself. Now from there, I'm going to start highlighting the shoulder and the body area with a lighter gray color, just as we did with the face. Now the difference between the body and the face area is that I will not use my smaller brushes as often, as I want this area to have much bigger but softer curls and not as defined. I want to push focus to the face and leave the body alone as a nice piece of the painting to look at, but I truly want the focus to be on the face area. This is the most identifiable and really the most exciting and likeness of the piece to the subject. So I want everyone to look at the face and then fall off to the body afterwards. I'm going to layer 3 to 4 different shades of gray in with my filbert and just be very picky on where I put these highlights. I will do this on both sides of the body in the Mars Black area before I start to develop the chest fur even further. Lastly, we are going to paint in the highlights and the details in the chest fur area. Now, I'm going to use my small filbert brush and 3 to 4 different shades of a lighter gray color, mixed with some burnt umber very slightly, and create the curls and paint flicks throughout the chest. Now, I am keeping in mind that I want to block these in slowly and leave them clumped with not as many details, as well as leaving some of that mid-tone and the shadows to shine through. I used a lot of caution not to overwork this area, as the brighter it gets, the more the eye will be drawn there. So I was very choosy on where I kept these highlights and how many I actually put in. Lastly, I wanted to finalize the mouth hairs, which I have saved until now, as they are the last and the topmost layer to this painting. So those little mustache hairs, or mouth hairs if you will, are covering that chest area under the chin, and those are what are casting that shadow we painted in. So we know with acrylic, we have to layer it, and those are going to be the last things we paint on. I am using my titanium white mix with a little bit of burnt umber from before, and I'm creating these long mustache hairs over top. I'm keeping in mind to have them sprouting many different ways to create a very interesting and realistic look, and making sure to not have them so perfect, which a lot of times is super hard to do. Everything wants to look neat and tidy, but I always have to remind myself to make sure that it looks authentic, messy, and as my reference does look. I will glaze in some burnt sienna on top as my final detail before I move on to the next subject. Now, I know that not everyone will be painting 2 subjects today, so I did want to leave the last subject of this painting as a small little time lapse for those who may find visual learning easier without my auditory instruction. But before we continue, I wanted to give a special shout out to our sponsors of today's video, Chartpak, Grumbacher, and Molotov, who supply my channel and all of my videos with the products you see being used, such as my paints, my palette paper, and of course, my brushes. Links can be found in the description box below, where you can purchase these supplies to follow along with me in each of my videos and use the same supplies that I do. If you've been enjoying today's video, consider hitting that like button, as well as leaving a comment of an animal that you would like to see me create a detailed tutorial for. Now, that being said, let's go ahead and get back to work. Alright, if you're still here at this point in the video and you're going to start watching the time lapse, just remember that we are going to rinse and repeat the exact same steps we used for subject 1 for subject 2. It is the exact same techniques. The only thing that is going to be changing is the fur pattern, the sort of textures that they may have. It is the same dog breed, but of course every dog is different. So just keep that in mind. Enjoy this time lapse and be sure to check out the end of the video where we see the final product. I'll see you in a second. Alright, and that is it for today's beautiful Bernedoodle painting. If you're still left wanting more and need a few more tips and tricks, you can check out this other video that I created covering how to paint straight black fur on a dog breed such as a Labrador.